All right, second BDE of the week. Talking Chevron deference today. You want to level set us? You want me to?
Go ahead, and I'll fill in.
I actually thought you were going to level set us, and so
I'll do it.
I didn't actually think you'd take me up on that.
But, Chevron, all the discussion around Chevron deference, we missed the heart of that in our being away on our travels, is around a Supreme Court ruling on June the 28th that effectively overturned what has come to be known since 1984 in a Reagan administration era case as the Chevron deference. And what essentially that means is the courts, in deciding or interpreting matters where an administrative agency is tasked with enforcing those laws, where Congress has left ambiguity or is silent on critical specific interpretation facts, has deferred automatically. In the 1984 case, the Chevron deference gives automatic deference to the expertise of the administrative agency, which is under the executive branch purview for interpretation of those laws.
So just one thing I'd kind of add to that. It makes sense that we write a law, we want X, Y, and Z, and we hand it to the executive branch, and the agency says, okay, I got to figure out how to do this. That makes sense. That's not nefarious in any way, shape, or form. And I think what Chevron basically did is, if the agency says we do X, Y, and Z, when we go to court, deference is given to the agency for coming up with X, Y, and Z. And it was a two-pronged test. It was like, did Congress speak directly about this? If they didn't, deference to the agency, assuming the agency's answer, and I think they called it, was a permissible construction of the law.
Right. Yeah. And passed a reasonableness and consistency test.
Yeah.
And that aspect of it goes all the way back to 1944, something called the Skidmore case, where the tenets of consistency and reasonableness over time, recognizing that the administrative agencies are not only the de facto experts in whatever area of regulation in applying the specific meaning of those laws, but they have the wherewithal to, just by mere fact of they are the experts in those particular areas. And we were talking before we got started here about what's happened, for example, with the EPA and in terms of its budget. I don't know if you wanted to get to that at this point, but
one of the things I think you and I did really well yesterday on BDE, if I can say that and not sound any more narcissistic than I already am, but yesterday we talked about two really bad things. We talked about CenterPoint. We talked about the assassination attempt on Trump. And we did both of those through the lens of do not attribute malice to what can be explained by incompetence, even though it was really hard to do that. Let me throw a lens out, and then we'll start talking about this more. Let me throw a lens out, and I'm going to talk Sally Yates. So Sally Yates, my mother, is the most wonderful person on the planet. She had 4 boys. And I don't know if she figured out early on that she was going to have to be judge, jury, and executioner 24 hours a day, and she didn't want to do it. Or I don't know. She grew up an only child. Or I don't know if this was just the wisdom of Sally. But one of the things Mom did in every situation was, Mom, Chuck's getting the last Snickers bar. Chuck, you cut the Snickers bar in half. Kenny gets first pick of 1 piece. Mom, I don't want to eat there, whatever. Chuck chooses on Monday night. Jay chooses on Tuesday night. And she constantly put in place rules that forced us participants, the 4 boys, to work it out amongst ourselves. And we all bought into the rules enough so that even though we lost, you kind of knew, well, that was just the rule. And there was always something you would get later. And it kind of forced you to and the reason I bring this up, because when we start talking about Chevron deference and it being overturned in the Loper case, is this is rules to the game type stuff. And what I worry about when we talk politics, and both sides do this, I'll give a little editorial comment and say I think the liberal side does it more, but conservatives do it too, is we want our outcome and we don't care how we get there, as opposed to worrying about the process and how it goes. Because, I mean, you were telling me this morning, and I didn't even realize it, the original Chevron case, even though it was a liberal court that decided it, is the Reagan administration was using it to deregulate.
Right. And that was a case that involved Chevron versus the Natural Resources Defense Council in its, at the time, application or enforcement of the Clean Air Act of 1977. And I don't remember all the particulars of the dispute, but that was a ruling in favor of Chevron. And I think people look at it particularly in today's environment, in the realm of energy politics, well, Chevron deference, they kind of get their way. Really what it does is automatically defers, the way I think about it, the interpretation to the administrative agency, which is clearly under the executive umbrella, and starts to get into, the fundamentals of separation of powers. And that's kind of a wonkish discussion, a constitutional wonkish discussion for another time, and neither of us are attorneys. But the notion that there's not a political pendulum, if you will, with changing administrations over time, that it only favors one point of view and limits what was heretofore a pretty broad ceding of interpretive powers to administrative agencies, or more fundamentally the executive branch. There is a political dynamic on both sides, depending on where we are in the political history and in the administrative political tilt of a particular administration.
I forget when the law was put in place, so I'll make up a number. It was, I think, the late 1800s. Because the way the United States used to work is a party, got elected president, and they immediately fired everybody that worked for the federal government in the executive branch, and they replaced it with their folks. It's called patronage, right? And that went back and forth. And at some point, a law was put in place that said, and there's probably some truth to this being at least a partially good thing, that no, we need to have stability there. We need to have people work for the EPA for 10 and 15 and 20 years and not be held to the whims of politicians. So they put a law in place that said, hey, you can't just fire civil servants without due cause, all that sort of stuff. But I will say this, back in the early 80s and up to that point, when you got a new administration and you had a new secretary of pick any of the agencies, commerce, whatever, and you got down and you appointed the head of the EPA, they could do something in the way of shifting the barge. It was huge. And so when Reagan came in, this court case you were talking about, it actually had to do with the one of the Clean Air, Clean Water Acts, and they were talking about a source of pollution, and the EPA defined the source as there's a hole right there and it's leaking. And the Reagan administration that wanted to come in and be more pro-business, less regulation, the EPA, they had them redefine a source as an entire plant. So you could be leaking methane over here, at the plant, but if you had some mitigation over here and the whole plant was net zero, it got through. So industry was able to use that to get more stuff done. So both sides are using this. I think what has happened over time is clearly bureaucracies have gotten bigger. It feels like they've gotten more entrenched and have more distance from political views they don't like. I mean, we're seeing this today. I mean, we were partially talking about it yesterday. And so in the Loper decision that just happened here, about a month ago, basically the court came back and said, hey, we're not going to immediately defer to the agency. We will give some credence to them, but hey, we're the judges. We're going to make an independent assessment of this. We're going to look at the evidence of both sides. And the liberals have gone nuts over that because I feel like they think they're losing the bureaucracy and when they were winning right now.
Well,
that's been the feedback from, Twitter and political types.
There's way more color of accusations of activism, no matter whether we're talking about the Supreme Court or administrative agencies. And so that is a political dynamic that has been elevated in decisions and discussions and debates like this. So I think the case that the Supreme Court ruled on here recently is a good example of the way I think about it, the somewhat unilateral decision, in this case, the National Marine Fisheries Agency. And it was all about.
Who even knew we had one of those in the government? But anyway, keep going.
We saw them in the Valdez.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
This was a commercial herring fishing operation in New England, and basically the crux issue is the fact that the interpretation that the NMFA had imposed upon commercial fishing operators was they were liable or responsible for paying the wages or the cost of having on board federal monitors, which, the number was $700 a day. And I can tell you from smaller commercial fishery experience and being around commercial fishermen, again in Valdez, the risks and margin on that business is about akin to small family farms and the cost burden. So this was a material issue, I think the court decided, of maybe a bit outside of the reasonable standard. And so thus overturned the rote deference that Chevron set up. And like everything else, there are no kind of absolutes. It won't be this way going forward. It's much grayer in terms of how the agencies and the plaintiffs are going to deal with this, but it does force the case making back to the judiciary to make a ruling on with respect to the reasonableness, consistency of the interpretation that the agency is now forced to work harder, at least in the Hill article. And there's a Hill article that was out yesterday that has a discussion, and it's an opinion piece, but it brings up a few historical precedents and some current things that are going on with other agencies, administrative agencies as well, as there's not going to be kind of a black and white cessation of the agencies having interpretive influence. They're just going to have to work harder to prove it in court.
Yeah, and so I think the politics today is the Supreme Court leans conservative. Therefore, any power going to the court today is viewed as bad as liberals, and so that's the kind of the reaction you're seeing. And I want to jump into that Hill article in just a second, but I found a couple of things interesting. Stare decisis, the legal theory of once something's decided, it becomes precedent, is really important to our culture and our legal system, because at the end of the day, consistency of rules is really important. John Roberts, who wrote the majority opinion, Chief Justice Roberts, actually addressed that, and he said it's been unworkable. He goes, every decision leads to different things, and so he said that's why they were comfortable overturning it. The majority opinion actually goes to that point right there of, hey, this is unworkable, blah blah blah. It was Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion that actually went to the separation of powers document that said,
of course,
yeah, exactly. That said, hey, Congress, if you want to charge $700 an hour to monitor this, say it. You have a pen. Go vote for it.
Yeah, and a more fundamental, I think, objective of that opinion and the way it was worded is really a message to Congress: be more specific and write clearer laws.
Yeah.
So remove as much ambiguity as you can. Now, they can't be written for every context in which there's an interpretation by an agency and a dispute that arises from that. But it is a pretty strong message. Whether we'll ever get to that much clearer legislative model remains to be seen. But I do think that, this just happened to be a case where relatively small business owners were faced with, a pretty onerous consequence of an interpretation that was under Chevron pretty much the unilateral purview of the agency itself.
So let's go back to Sally Yates real quick, and then I want to get back to the article you read. Sally Yates knew that in every conflict, one person would be disappointed. And so if the rules were fair and consistent, you accepted it and moved on better. I think what we've seen under Chevron, listening to feedback, is I got charged $700 a day for this. This is bankrupting my business. I try to deal with the agency. They have full power. I can't do anything there. I go to court. The court has no ability except to defer back to the agency. And oh, by the way, all the bureaucrats that I'm dealing with are in effect employees for life that don't answer to anyone. They certainly weren't elected. They weren't appointed by the current president, reflecting voting or anything. And so you had a sense that this just isn't fair. I have no recourse up against my government. And I hate lawsuits. I hate that we adjudicate as much of the stuff as we do. And as much as, our judicial system is a mess, it's expensive, burdensome, and all that, at least you have a trial with a judge. And then you have an appeals court. And then beyond an appeals court, you do have a Supreme Court. You at least have some sort of process that if you lose, you feel like you had a shot. Because what under the Chevron deference standard, it felt a lot like when the NFL commissioner finds you and you appeal to the commissioner.
Right.
Yeah. So,
but I think, what it does is bring more equilibrium back to the separation and balance of powers among the three branches of government, because there is a political motivation and temptation to use the administrative agencies for an agenda, and the process, while messy and cumbersome, forces putting a finer point on the debate. And as the Hill article pointed out, the agencies are going to have to work harder to make an effective case. And so the ball's back in their court to do that. Now, that doesn't mean the court can't rely on things like Skidmore, which means if there is precedent in the agency's interpretation and decision-making, then there will be some continued softer deference, if you will. But I think it forces a sharper focus on making sure that those interpretations are proven reasonable and not outside the bounds of what deference was originally intended to do. I mean, from a practical standpoint, these very specific issues, regulatory issues, by and large, have to rely on the expertise of the lifetime experts that you were previously discussing.
Because that's the other side of this, and potentially what 5 years from now we'll be bitching about is we had somebody that was an undergrad political science major who then went to law school, who then clerked for a judge, who then practiced, make it up, family law for 5 years, got appointed to the bench, is sitting there deciding how arsenic levels in an electric plant. That's the flip side is, wouldn't we rather have the EPA expert who's been there? The problem with that goes back to the saying of, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts. Absolutely.
So this isn't just an energy issue, but it's interesting what are the implications for energy, and front and center in our discussions on regular BDE have been about the big corporate mergers, most notably Pioneer Exxon, and even more specifically than that, what the FTC did with respect to the consent order and the, removal of Scott Sheffield from candidacy for the board.
We'll approve your deal if Scott's not on the board. Yeah.
And so there was not specifically to this case, but part of the article, and I'd written in the notes, FTC Commission Chair Lena Hidalgo, it's Lena Khan. Lena Hidalgo's a bit more front of mind given what's happened over the last week.
Harris County judge. Yeah.
She recently admitted that her agency was waging costly legal challenges against high-profile corporate mergers, even those are likely to fail. And really the objective here is, and not only in this case, look, Congress, change the law. And so there's a de facto lobbying by an administrative agency to either remove the ambiguities or create a new law that is more politically aligned with our objectives. And so that's not going to stop.
Yeah.
Now that introduces more messy and costly litigation. And as we were talking about it before the show as well, I can kind of see the Exxon response to the activist proxy resolution challenges, the suit that they engaged or filed in Fort Worth against the two activist hedge funds, as Exxon saying, this is my read or conclusion. Exxon saying, look, this is an example of the SEC aggressively interpreting something that has resulted in repeat nuisances in the form of kind of redundant proxies that have proven over a period of years to actually receive declining support. And companies have to dedicate quite a bit of time and resources to defending those actions. So is this putting the interpretation in this case back squarely in the judiciary and somewhat of a first derivative test of the Chevron doctrine, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. There's a side of the world that says we need a crusader like the FTC chairman to defend the small person and want them to be a rabble rouser. And then there's another view of it as, I'm a spoiled kid. I'm going to take my marbles and go home. And yeah, no, it's not something that's going to end soon.
I mean, prior to things like FDA and consumer product safety and all the OSHA, all those things, you read about really the time period where Teddy Roosevelt was coming on the scene as the progressive Republican. There's a lot of foundational aspects that have made the health, well-being, and safety of American citizens a lot better because these regulatory frameworks were established,
right?
And these mechanisms. So
Coke used to have cocaine in it.
Right.
Smoking used to be recommended by 4 out of 5 doctors. I mean, we definitely had it. All right.
So what does it mean for energy?
That's going to be interesting. What it means for energy. I think, kind of looking into the crystal ball, are the energy companies going to have a little bit of a shot, a fairer playing field, if you will, when dealing with the EPA and other places? My gut kind of says yes, but it's not actually going to benefit the small entrepreneur like we think it should. It's going to benefit the bigger companies that can, hey, let's take this all the way to the Supreme Court.
I'll take it down to a specific with the emergence and somewhat mushrooming of things like net zero, phase 1, 2, and
right,
or scope 1, 2, and 3. And you and I both know, and we've talked about it, that introduces a compounding level of ambiguity because there's not a lot of absolute reliable data. And how do you set the boundary conditions on complying with future regulation and legislation vis-a-vis things like net zero, emissions reduction, and other things that are more measurable will be easy. But if it's left to a somewhat politicized administrative agency, I don't care which side in which administration in the future, these things are going to have to be litigated, where there are precedents that can be set that will result in, I think, unpredictable, but we know much greater cost and inefficiencies in the system,
right,
for both businesses and the budget that the taxpayers fund for these administrative agencies. We're talking about the EPA. Over the last 20 years, the budget's gone from what to what?
I think it was 3.7 to 10.2 billion over 20 years, and employees are up like 1.6x, the growth of, it's interesting you say that because everything you just said about net zero is going to apply to AI as well. You're going to have what's permissible, what's appropriate copyright, what's not, who owns what. So yeah, it'll be interesting to watch the, at the end of the day, the founding fathers, although I think they'd be mortified by the federal government today if they were alive. But at the end of the day, I mean, the only reason the federal government is the size it is today and that we have the freedoms we retain in the United States is because of the checks and balances. So I usually err on the side of anything that has the government fighting among itself is probably pretty good, and anything that gives absolute power. There was one great moment. So my favorite teacher I've ever had in my life was Gilbert Cuthbertson, Doc C, my political science professor at Rice. He taught us constitutional law, and I'll change the name to protect the innocent. I take con law. I wind up tied with Mike Bossy for the highest grade in the class. And we go in and we're picking up our finals, and I made a 98 on it, and so did Mike Bossy. And Doc was deaf, and so he kind of talked funny. I think being deaf was selective. He chose to hear certain things. He chose not to hear something. Anyway, Doc's going, all right, Mike, I'm going to understand how Chuck makes a 98 because he came to every class. He bought all the books. He came to the tutorials. And Chuck and I talked con law all the time at lunch. I get that. Mike, you didn't show up for any class. You didn't even buy the books and read them. You and I have never talked about this, yet you made a 98 and Chuck made a 98. Please explain. And Mike Posse just looked Doc in the eye and said, Doc, it's pretty easy. It's constitutional law. The feds always win. And walked off. And Doc goes, damn it, he's right. And so Doc, after that, coined the bossy rule of constitutional law. Feds always win. So real quick, while we're on the feds, big announcement last night. Trump has chosen J.D. Vance, the freshman senator, 4 months in, or 6
from
months
Ohio.
In, from Ohio as his running mate.
First millennial.
Yeah, 39
on
years
a
old.
Presidential ticket. His background, if you haven't read his life story to this point or prior to all of his success in becoming a United States Marine, Ohio State, and then ultimately getting through Yale Law School, Hillbilly Elegy. It's one of the most harrowing, dysfunctional upbringing stories that you can imagine. There's a movie that was out 2 or 3 years ago, Hillbilly Elegy. I find in the cliche analysis that the book is way better than the movie.
Right.
I found it to be a bit of a chaotic artistic mess.
Right.
Kind of like my comparison of Bohemian Rhapsody, good, versus Rocket Man, really just an artistic mess. I got kind of the first inclination to read the book. This was back in 2015 or 2016, and the person who urged us all to read it was Bobby Tudor. And this was right around the emergence of the Trump campaign. Vance is from the Rust Belt in, I believe it's Youngstown, Ohio. And, he had a severely drug addicted mother and was essentially raised by a kind of nails tough grandmother. But all of the dysfunction is at almost caricature levels in what he went through as a child and developing in obviously a much poorer economic circumstance than any of us has experienced. But it is an American kind of bootstrap success story. I was a little surprised by the choice. It didn't, because he's somewhat famously being challenged on the fact that he is in the recent past been basically making comments that would indicate he's a quote unquote never Trumper.
He called Trump Hitler.
Yeah.
He did,
And if we think back to the presidential debates from 2020, where Kamala was still in the race, some of the things she said about Joe Biden, it's politically expedient in the moment.
Right.
And so with that cynical view, I do think it's an interesting choice in that if you could draw a boundary line around Trump's base, that's J.D. Vance's heritage.
Yeah.
But he's also, I think, a resounding success story of coming out of those circumstances and all the things that he's done in a short 39 years to overcome.
Because there's also a military career in there. Didn't he serve in
the Marines?
In the Marines, and didn't he see combat?
Yes,
saw combat, and then there was a tech career, right?
Right. He was originally Silicon Valley, Peter Thiel, and that peer group. They ultimately funded his own VC firm to focus on technology investments outside of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
So I would take that as more Midwest and kind of manufacturing related.
Yeah.
But I don't remember all the details around that. But Bloomberg Green was out this morning. It's one of their series of newsletters that are free that are out this morning. They've already labeled him a quote unquote climate denier. Well, keep in mind, he is one of two senators from Ohio, which is home to the Utica, Point Pleasant, and Marcellus. And so, there is I think we have a climate problem comments that he made back in 2020 are being used as a basis to really paint him as a flip-flopper.
Yeah.
He's a young guy like everyone else. You can adjust your worldview based upon experiences and information. But
and quite frankly, jobs.
Right.
This
is going to be an interesting dynamic as they hit the post-convention campaign trail and start to see what some of the kind of slings and arrows are thrown their way.
So interesting thing for me is, and if you look at kind of narratives out there, Trump doesn't want someone to show him up. Vance could show him up. Vance, whether you like him or don't like him, incredibly articulate and smart, whether you agree or disagree, he is. So that was interesting. Doesn't feel like it increases the reach. There was no, there's no Nikki Haley reach out to the 20% that didn't vote for me. Tim Scott reach out to a group that historically I've gotten 10% of the vote of and hopes to get. So it doesn't appear base broadening in any way, shape, or form. It feels like he potentially chose his successor. I mean, he went with youth. That being said, and again, I don't care if you like Trump or hate Trump. We all look. He is as shrewd a politician as we've seen. I mean, I think his instincts rival Bill Clinton. Again, like Clinton, hate Clinton. Clinton's the best politician we've had. He just is. And I think Trump has equal level instincts. And I think what Trump is doing with this is he's basically saying, can I peel off Silicon Valley a little bit? I got a tech guy. He's young. He's consistent with my values, love him or hate him. He's consistent with me particularly when it comes to protectionism, bring jobs home, manufacturing. And I'm wondering if they're just going to throw Vance in basically the Midwest, and he's just going to be doing the loop. I don't know that that's going to be as effective as it sounds, because if you look at his senatorial race, he won by 6 points, and the Republican governor Devine won by 25 points. Now, Devine didn't have as challenging a race, and there's some mitigating circumstances there. So it was definitely a pick that said, hey, base, this is your guy. It was, hey, this guy's going to be my heir apparent. Actually shows something that people don't think Trump has. Guy called him Hitler 4 years ago, and Trump's forgiven him, and the like. It doesn't expand the base, but I think Trump's saying, I'm winning anyway, and I'm just setting this up so that it lasts beyond me.
I do think his Yale Law pedigree and his Silicon Valley history certainly are impactful with coastal money and the coastal heavyweights. May not at all be related, but I think I saw something this morning where Elon has committed to funding or donating $45 million a month to Trump's super PAC.
It's like $180 million total.
Yeah. So I guess that covers the span of the campaign going forward until November. So, interesting choice. I kind of thought after the events of this weekend, Vivek might be the really bombastic choice, if you will. But, very different backgrounds between Vivek and J.D. Vance, but in terms of their professional path and success, there are a lot of similarities there. Both are lawyers. Both were involved in technology. One is a VC, the other is a biotech entrepreneur.
Well, one other point on this is, and I think it's horrible that Biden sent out an attack tweet on JD Vance quicker than he sent out a tweet when Trump got shot. I mean, that just, I'm sorry, that bugs me. And, but number two on this, one of the attacks is going to be, he's not qualified to be president.
Because he's too young.
Because he's, too young and inexperienced. And I agree with that, but it's a little disingenuous to make that argument when Barack Obama was your presidential candidate. Because let's do a little bit of math here. Community organizer, state senator, I believe just one term as a state senator, 2 years as a U.S. senator when he declared for president. So that's Barack Obama is prepared to be president. Everyone rallied around it. J.D. Vance, military service, which I'm going to say far outweighs community organizer and state senate. So military service, saw combat duty, business career, and at least faced the voters and has been serving as a senator. It's kind of hard to sit there and say, oh yeah, this guy's clearly qualified and this guy's not. That to me is a bit of a push and the like.
And a bootstrap story, I think, at least in this generation.
To Barack Obama's credit, he had that one too.
Yeah, but the circumstances from birth were very different.
Yeah. But anyway, so yeah, no, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I'm actually really looking forward to Trump's speech because, at least his talk has been, I wrote the best speech ever. It was going to be bombastic, blah, blah, blah. I've torn it up. And he's going to talk about unity. Because I've always said about Trump, if he could ever just reach out to the other side and look presidential and realize and when Oilfield Rando and I were texting each other back and forth during the debate, I kept saying, Trump looks so petty that he keeps going back to the last argument, And
this was back in 2018. I have a friend from childhood who is as kind of diehard rock rib conservative and MAGA as it gets. It was up in Dallas Fort Worth. We were sitting at a baseball game, and there was some just kind of dust up that Trump was making worse because of the messaging, I think primarily on Twitter. And I said to my friend, has he ever had a presidential moment in his life? And he said, what the hell does that matter?
Yeah. And that's no, that's right. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. Cause if we've talked enough about this on BDE. In general, you want a Republican president in there for your ability to operate as an industry. That also leads to more production, which leads to lower price. And you want, if you want higher prices, put a diehard Democrat in there because you can't do anything when they're in there. So,
one update on the CenterPoint story. I don't know if you saw this. Tony Busby, who represented the plaintiffs against Deshaun Watson.
Yeah.
Well-known Houston attorney, has a cohort of restaurant owners who are filing a class action lawsuit against CenterPoint.
Yeah. And that'll be interesting because I've hung out with Busby a couple of times because he and Lee Majors are big friends. See, I just worked that in effortlessly.
As Maxine used to say in the Chronicle, the soft thud of name dropping.
Whop, bam. But anyway, I actually like him. Speaking of, he's a former military guy. He was a Marine and stuff.
An Aggie.
I would not want, he's on the board. Yeah. I would not want to mess with that dude if I was CenterPoint. So, all righty. See you tomorrow.
This was fun.
All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Sorry we're barraging you with podcasts this week, but there was just so much to catch up on. We may shoot even out another one this week. And if you enjoyed the podcast, share it with somebody, subscribe to it. Peace out.